The saloon fell silent when Nora Blackburn walked in, the weight of 40 years riding on her shoulders like an invisible shawl. It was not her first time crossing that threshold, but it was her first time doing so unescorted. Cripple Creek, Colorado had been her home for 15 years, yet somehow she still felt like an outsider whenever all eyes turned to her. She was the town's seamstress, respected for her skill with a needle but pitied for her unmarried status. The year was 1889, and while the century was growing old, the West remained young and wild. Most women her age were grandmothers by now, their lives defined by the achievements of their children and the loving companionship of a husband. Nora had neither. "Miss Blackburn," called Willard Hayes from behind the bar, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone addressing the bereaved. "What brings you out this evening? Everything all right with your shop?" Nora nodded curtly, moving toward an empty table near the back. "Just needed a change of scenery, Mr. Hayes. A woman can only stare at the same four walls for so long before she starts to feel like part of the furniture." A few chuckles rippled through the room, but the tension remained. Women like her, unmarried, independent, and no longer possessing the bloom of youth, existed in a strange limbo in towns like Cripple Creek. Too respectable to be treated like the saloon girls who worked upstairs, yet too unattached to be fully embraced by the married women who ruled the town's social circles. Nora had come to accept this reality years ago when her 30th birthday passed without a proposal. By 35, the well-meaning questions about potential suitors had stopped. At 40, people spoke about her prospects for marriage only in hushed tones, as if discussing a terminal illness. "I'll have a whiskey," she told Hayes when he approached her table. She ignored his raised eyebrow. She was past the age of caring what others thought of a woman drinking alone. The saloon doors swung open again, bringing with them a gust of autumn air and a man Nora had never seen before. He stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the room with the careful gaze of someone accustomed to taking the measure of strangers. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but unlike many drifters who passed through Cripple Creek, there was something refined about him. His coat was well-tailored despite the wear, and his hat, though battered by wind and weather, had clearly been expensive once. He moved to the bar with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Nora estimated him to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the open sky. "What can I get you, stranger?" Hayes asked, leaning against the bar. "Whatever's not likely to blind me," the man replied, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Nora couldn't quite place. "Eastern, perhaps, and some information if you're willing to sell it." "Depends on what kind of information you're after," Hayes said cautiously. "I'm looking for someone who can repair this." The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of fabric that Nora recognized instantly as fine silk, brocade, the kind used in expensive waistcoats and ladies' evening gowns. "Got caught in a bramble 2 days back, and it's the only decent piece of clothing I own," Hayes laughed. "Well, you're in luck. We've got the best seamstress this side of Denver." He pointed toward Nora's table. "Miss Blackburn over there. She could mend a butterfly's wing without it missing a beat." The stranger turned, and for the first time his eyes met Nora's. They were gray, the color of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He nodded politely and approached her table, removing his hat as he did so. "Miss Blackburn," he said. "Would you mind if I joined you?" Nora gestured to the empty chair across from her. "It's your reputation at stake, Mr. Ryder." "Roland Ryder," he supplied, settling into the chair. "And reputation is a luxury afforded to those who stay in one place long enough to cultivate one." Then why care about a tear in your waistcoat? She asked, taking a sip of her whiskey. A smile touched the corners of his mouth. Even a drifter has his vanities, Miss Blackburn. He unfolded the fabric on the table between them, revealing an intricately patterned brocade in deep burgundy with silver threading. Can you fix it? Nora examined the tear with a professional eye. The bramble had caught it good, leaving a jagged 3-inch rip along a seam. I can. It'll cost you $2. $2, he repeated, eyebrows lifting. Highway robbery. Quality work commands quality prices, Mr. Ryder, she replied evenly. And silk brocade requires a special touch. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. When can I collect it? Tomorrow afternoon. My shop is on Pine Street, just past the general store. I'll be there. He refolded the fabric and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Nora was surprised by the unexpected flutter in her chest. It had been a long time since she'd felt that particular sensation, that awareness of a man not as a customer or a neighbor, but as a man. What brings you to Cripple Creek, Mr. Ryder? She asked, tucking the waistcoat into her satchel. We're not exactly on the main thoroughfare. I go where opportunity takes me, he replied vaguely. Right now, that happens to be here. I hear there's good mining to be had in these parts. There was, Nora corrected. The boom days are behind us now, though there's still enough color in the creeks to keep the dreamers coming. And what about you, Miss Blackburn? He asked, signaling to Hayes for a drink. Are you a dreamer? Nora laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. I'm a pragmatist, Mr. Ryder. Dreams are for the young, and you consider yourself old. He seemed genuinely curious, his head tilting slightly as he regarded her. Before she could answer, the saloon doors burst open again, this time admitting Sheriff Tom Caldwell and his deputy, young Ned Parker. They scanned the room with purpose, their eyes eventually settling on Ryder. That's him, Parker said, pointing. That's the fellow Mrs. Miller described. Caldwell approached their table, his hand resting casually on his holster. Evening, Nora, he said, nodding to her before turning his attention to Ryder. You just ride into town today, mister? Ryder leaned back in his chair, seemingly unperturbed by the lawman's interest. That I did, Sheriff. Is there a problem? Might be. Stage was robbed about 10 miles east of here yesterday. Driver described a man matching your description. Nora felt a chill run down her spine. She had just invited this man to her shop, her home. That's unfortunate, Ryder said calmly. For both the stage and for me, since I was nowhere near here yesterday. I came from the west, having spent the last week in Silver Cliff. Can anyone vouch for that? Caldwell asked. The innkeeper at the Silver Palace can. I stayed there 3 nights. Caldwell exchanged a glance with his deputy. We'll be checking on that, Mr. Ryder, Roland Ryder. In the meantime, I'd advise you not to leave town. Ryder spread his hands in a gesture of compliance. I've business with Miss Blackburn tomorrow anyway. I'll be around. After the lawman departed, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Nora found herself reassessing the man across from her. Was he truly a thief, or simply unfortunate enough to resemble one? I should go, she said, reaching for her satchel. Wait, Ryder said, his voice low. I understand your concern, Miss Blackburn, but I assure you I'm not in the habit of robbing stage coaches. I'm many things, but not that. What are you then? She challenged. He considered the question for a moment. A man looking for a place to belong, he finally said. No more, no less. There was something in his eyes, a weariness that matched her own, that made Nora pause. Against her better judgment, she found herself wanting to believe him. Tomorrow afternoon, she said, rising from her chair. Don't be late. I wouldn't dream of it, he replied with a slight bow of his head. As Nora walked home through the darkening streets of Cripple Creek, She couldn't help but wonder about the enigmatic Mr. Ryder. There was something different about him, something that had stirred feelings she'd long thought dormant. But she was too old to indulge in such foolishness, she reminded herself firmly. Too old for the fluttering heart and girlish fantasies that led nowhere but disappointment, or so they all said. Roland Ryder watched Nora Blackburn leave the saloon, his eyes lingering on the proud set of her shoulders and the confident stride that spoke of a woman comfortable in her own independence. She intrigued him. Most unmarried women her age that he'd encountered wore their spinsterhood like a shroud, their movements small and apologetic, as if trying to take up as little space as possible in a world that had no place for them. Not Nora Blackburn. She moved through the world as if she had every right to be in it, regardless of whether she had a husband at her side. It was refreshing and more than a little attractive. "You're playing with fire there, stranger," commented Hayes as he collected Ryder's empty glass. "How so?" Ryder asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Nora's good folk, but she's set in her ways. Town's been trying to match her up for years, but she's turned down every offer. Folks say she's too old for marriage now, too independent." "Is that right?" Ryder mused, more to himself than to Hayes. "And what does Miss Blackburn say about that?" Hayes shrugged. "She doesn't say much of anything these days. Just keeps to herself, runs her shop, and occasionally graces us with her presence here when the solitude gets to be too much, I reckon." Ryder nodded thoughtfully. "A woman who knows her own mind, that's rare enough to be worth noting. Just don't go getting any ideas," Hayes warned. "Sheriff's already got his eye on you, and this town protects its own." "Duly noted," Ryder replied, leaving a coin on the bar as he stood. "Can you direct me to lodgings for the night?" Hayes pointed him toward a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Holloway, and Ryder set off into the night, his thoughts lingering on the seamstress with the direct gaze and no-nonsense manner. The next morning, Nora rose before dawn, as was her habit. She lit the lamps in her modest two-room home attached to her shop and set water to boil for tea. As the first gray light of day filtered through the curtains, she settled at her work table with Roland Ryder's waistcoat spread before her. It was even finer than she'd initially realized. The silk was of the highest quality, the pattern intricate, and the craftsmanship exceptional. This was not the garment of a common drifter or miner. It spoke of wealth and refinement, of a life far removed from the dusty streets of Cripple Creek. Who was Roland Ryder, really? And what had brought him to their little corner of Colorado? Nora's fingers worked deftly as her mind wandered, selecting a thread that matched the burgundy silk perfectly and beginning the delicate process of mending the tear. It was the kind of detailed work she excelled at, the kind that had built her reputation across 3 counties and kept her in business even as the mining boom had faded. A knock at her shop door startled her from her reverie. It was early yet, not quite 8 o'clock, and she rarely had customers before 9. Setting aside her work, she crossed to the door, pausing to check her appearance in the small mirror hanging nearby. She frowned at what she saw: a face lined by years and weather, hair streaked with silver that she hadn't bothered to pin up yet, cascading past her shoulders in waves. She looked every one of her 40 years this morning. With a sigh, she opened the door to find Sheriff Caldwell standing there, hat in hand. "Tom," she greeted him. "You're out and about early." "Morning, Nora," he replied. "May I come in? I wanted to speak with you about that fellow from the saloon last night." Nora stepped aside to let him enter, gesturing toward a chair near her work table. "I've barely met the man, Tom. I don't know what I can tell you." "That's just it," Caldwell said, settling his substantial frame onto the delicate chair with care. "I don't want you knowing him any better until we sort out who he is and what he's doing here." His story checks out about Silver Cliff, sent a telegram this morning and got confirmation he was there, but that doesn't mean he's not trouble. He asked me to mend a tear in his waistcoat, Nora said dryly. Hardly the crime of the century. Caldwell's weathered face creased into a frown. You know what I mean, Nora. Men like that, drifters with no ties and fancy clothes, they're usually running from something, or someone. Or perhaps he's simply traveling, she countered, returning to her work table. Not everyone who passes through Cripple Creek has a nefarious purpose, Tom. No, but enough of them do that it pays to be cautious. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. Just be careful, that's all I'm asking. Don't go getting yourself involved with someone you know nothing about. Nora felt a flare of irritation. I'm hardly some naive girl to be swept off her feet by the first handsome stranger who pays me a compliment, Sheriff. I'm a grown woman who's managed quite well on her own for a good many years. I know that, he said, softening his tone. You're one of the most level-headed people in this town, Nora. I just hate to see that change. After Caldwell left, Nora returned to her work with renewed focus, determined to finish Ryder's waistcoat well before he was due to collect it. She had other orders to complete: a wedding dress for young Lily Cooper, trousers for the Peterson boys, a new Sunday suit for Reverend Mitchell. Her days were full of other people's moments and milestones, their celebrations and necessities. It was a good life, she reminded herself. A useful one. If sometimes she longed for more, for someone to share the quiet evenings with, for a hand to hold as she walked down the street, for a pair of eyes that lit up at the sight of her, well, that was a private yearning she had learned to live with. By mid-afternoon, the waistcoat was finished, the tear so expertly mended that even a discerning eye would struggle to find it. Nora had just wrapped it in brown paper when the shop bell jingled, announcing a customer. Roland Ryder stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking considerably more presentable than he had the previous evening. He'd shaved, and his dark hair was neatly combed. He wore a simple white shirt with suspenders and dark trousers, clean if somewhat worn. "Miss Blackburn," he greeted her with a slight bow, "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," she replied, gesturing to the wrapped package on her counter. "I've just finished." He approached, setting his hat aside as he reached for the package. "May I?" At her nod, he unwrapped it carefully, spreading the waistcoat on the counter to examine her work. His fingers traced the area where the tear had been, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Remarkable. I can't even tell it was damaged." "That's rather the point," Nora said, though she couldn't help feeling pleased by his appreciation. "You're an artist, Miss Blackburn." He looked up at her, his gray eyes warm with genuine admiration. "I've had work done by tailors in New York and Boston that wasn't half as fine as this." "New York and Boston," she echoed. "You're a long way from home, Mr. Ryder." "Home is a relative concept," he replied, carefully refolding the waistcoat. "But yes, I was born and raised back east, Massachusetts originally. What brought you west?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her. He reached into his pocket and withdrew $2 silver, placing them on the counter. "The same thing that brings most men west, a fresh start." There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions on that particular subject. "I understand the sheriff paid you a visit this morning." Nora raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast in small towns." "So I'm learning," he said with a wry smile. "Did he warn you about the dangerous drifter?" "Something to that effect," she admitted. Ryder nodded, accepting this without apparent offense. "He's right to be cautious. A town like this depends on knowing who to trust." "And are you trustworthy, Mr. Ryder?" The question slipped out before Nora could reconsider it. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I try to be," he finally said. though I've made my share of mistakes." He picked up his hat, turning it in his hands. "I wonder, Miss Blackburn, if you might allow me to thank you properly for your exceptional work. Perhaps dinner at the hotel restaurant this evening." Nora stared at him, momentarily speechless. It had been years since a man had asked to escort her anywhere, let alone to dinner. The proper response would be to decline politely but firmly. That's what the town would expect of her to maintain her dignity as a respectable, unmarried woman of a certain age. But something in Roland Ryder's straightforward manner made her hesitate. There was no pity in his invitation, no sense that he was extending charity to a lonely spinster. He simply looked at her as if her company would be genuinely welcome. "Why?" she asked bluntly. His eyebrows rose. "Why what? Why ask me to dinner? You don't know me, Mr. Ryder." "That's precisely why," he replied. "I find you interesting, Miss Blackburn. And I enjoy interesting company over a good meal." He smiled, a genuine expression that creased the corners of his eyes. "No ulterior motives, I assure you. Just dinner and conversation." Nora considered him for a moment longer, then made a decision that surprised even herself. "Very well, Mr. Ryder, I accept your invitation." "Excellent," he said, his smile broadening. "Shall I call for you at 7? "That would be suitable," she replied, suddenly feeling slightly breathless, as if she'd agreed to something far more daring than a simple dinner. After he left, Nora stood motionless behind her counter, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake. Tongues would wag, of course. They always did in a town like Cripple Creek. The respectable spinster dining with the mysterious stranger, it would be the talk of the Ladies' Aid Society for weeks. But as she closed her shop early to prepare for the evening, Nora found that she cared less about the gossip than she would have expected. At 40, perhaps she had finally earned the right to do as she pleased without concern for others' opinions. In her bedroom, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed and withdrew a dress she hadn't worn in years, a deep blue silk with a modest neckline and sleeves that gathered elegantly at the wrists. She had made it for herself 3 years ago, for a Christmas social that she had ultimately not attended due to illness. It still fit, though perhaps a bit more snugly than it once had. As she dressed, Nora caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at her seemed both familiar and strange, the same features she saw daily, yet somehow transformed by the simple act of dressing for an evening out. Her hair, swept up and pinned with a silver comb that had belonged to her mother, revealed a neck that was still slender and elegant. The blue of the dress brought out the deeper blue of her eyes. She was no longer young, that much was true. The lines at the corners of her eyes and mouth spoke of years lived, of laughter and tears and long days bent over her work. But neither was she the withered crone that the town's attitude sometimes made her feel like. "Well, Nora Blackburn," she said softly to her reflection, "let's see what the evening brings." Precisely at 7 o'clock, a knock came at her door. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Nora crossed the room and opened it to find Roland Ryder standing there, looking transformed from the dusty traveler who had first entered her shop. He wore the newly mended burgundy waistcoat over a crisp white shirt, with a black jacket and matching trousers that, while not new, were clearly of fine quality. His hair was neatly combed, and she caught the faint scent of bay rum aftershave. "Miss Blackburn," he said, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Ryder," she replied, reaching for her shawl. "You clean up rather well yourself." He offered his arm with an old-fashioned formality that touched something deep within her. "Shall we scandalize the town together?" Despite herself, Nora laughed. "I believe we shall, Mr. Ryder." They walked arm in arm down Pine Street toward the Grand Hotel, the finest establishment in Cripple Creek. Nora was acutely aware of the curious glances and outright stares from passers-by, but found, to her surprise, that she didn't mind them. There was something rather exhilarating about being the subject of speculation rather than pity for once. The hotel's dining room was half full when they arrived, populated mostly by traveling businessmen and a few of the town's more affluent couples. A hush fell over the room as they were shown to a table near the window, but Ryder seemed either oblivious to or unconcerned by the attention. "I took the liberty of speaking to the chef earlier," he said as they settled into their seats. "He's preparing something special this evening, trout almondine. I hope that's to your liking." "Very much so," Nora replied, impressed by his thoughtfulness. "Though I'm curious how you convinced Chef Marcel to deviate from his usual fare. He's notorious for refusing special requests." Ryder's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Let's just say I appealed to his Parisian sensibilities. A fellow expatriate far from home. You speak French?" Nora asked, increasingly intrigued by her dinner companion. "Enough to get by," he admitted. "My mother insisted on what she called a complete education, which included languages, literature, and the arts. She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," he agreed, a shadow of old grief passing briefly across his face. "She passed when I was 20. Consumption." "I'm sorry," Nora said softly. "My own mother died when I was 12. My father followed 3 years later." Ryder's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "That's a heavy burden for a young girl to bear. Did you have family to take you in?" Nora shook her head. "No close relatives. I was apprenticed to a dressmaker in Denver, Mrs. Eleanor Finch. She taught me the trade and gave me a home until I was old enough to make my own way. I came to Cripple Creek when I was 25, just as the silver boom was starting, and opened my shop. 15 years, he mused. You've put down roots here. Deep ones, she agreed. Though sometimes I wonder what my life might have been if I'd chosen differently. If I'd stayed in Denver or gone further west to San Francisco. Do you regret it? He asked, his gaze direct and searching. Staying here, Nora considered the question carefully. No, she finally said. I've built something here, a business, a reputation, friendships. It's a good life, if a quiet one. Their conversation paused as the waiter arrived with their meal, the promised trout, served with roasted potatoes and early spring vegetables. The food was excellent, living up to the Grand Hotel's reputation as the finest dining establishment in 3 counties. As they ate, Ryder told her more about himself, his childhood in Boston, his education at Harvard, his work as an attorney in his father's law firm. But when Nora asked what had brought him west, he again became evasive, speaking in generalities about seeking adventure and new opportunities. You're not being entirely forthcoming, Mr. Ryder, Nora observed as they finished their meal. I can't help but wonder what you're hiding. He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. You're right, of course. The truth is, I left Boston under something of a cloud. My father had arranged a marriage for me to the daughter of his business partner, a politically advantageous match that would have solidified the family's position in society. And you objected, Nora guessed. Vehemently, he confirmed. Not to the young lady herself, she was perfectly pleasant, but to the concept of having my life arranged without my consent. I refused, rather publicly. There was a scene at a social event, harsh words exchanged with my father, and ultimately, a disownment. He spoke matter-of-factly, but Nora could see the old pain in his eyes. I headed west the next day with what money I had saved and haven't looked back since. That must have been difficult, Nora said, her heart aching for the younger man he had been, forced to choose between his independence and his family. It was the right choice, he said firmly, though not always an easy one. I've worked as everything from a ranch hand to a schoolteacher in the years since. Currently, I'm employed as a land surveyor for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. They're considering a new spur line through this area, which is what brings me to Cripple Creek. A surveyor, Nora repeated, relief washing through her. It was a respectable profession, and it explained his presence in their town. That's quite different from practicing law. It keeps me outdoors and moving, he said with a smile. Two things I've found essential to my happiness. And now, Miss Blackburn, I believe I've monopolized the conversation long enough. Tell me more about yourself. What brings joy to your life? The question caught Nora off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her happiness rather than her usefulness or her business. I enjoy reading, she said after a moment. And music, though we don't get many traveling musicians through Cripple Creek these days. And I find satisfaction in my work, in creating something beautiful or restoring something damaged. Like my waistcoat, he said with a warm smile. Exactly like that, she agreed. There's something deeply gratifying about taking something broken and making it whole again. As they continued talking, Nora found herself relaxing more than she had in years. Roland Ryder was an excellent conversationalist, knowledgeable about a wide range of subjects and genuinely interested in her opinions. He treated her neither as a curiosity nor as an object of pity, but as an equal, a woman of substance whose thoughts and experiences were valuable. By the time they finished their dessert, a delicate apple tart with cinnamon cream, nearly 3 hours had passed. The dining room had largely emptied, with only a few lingering guests remaining. I should get you home, Ryder said, noting the lateness of the hour. I've kept you out scandalously late. I believe we established earlier that scandal was on the evening's agenda, Nora replied with a smile. He laughed, a rich, warm sound that made her heart do that unexpected flutter again. So we did. Still, I wouldn't want to damage your reputation irreparably. At my age, Mr. Ryder, reputation is largely settled, she said, rising from her chair. But I appreciate your concern. The night air was cool as they stepped out of the hotel, the stars brilliant above the small town. Ryder offered Nora his arm again, and they walked slowly back toward her shop, neither seeming eager for the evening to end. I've had a wonderful time, Nora said as they approached her door. Thank you for the invitation. The pleasure was entirely mine, he replied. I haven't enjoyed an evening so much in a very long time. They reached her doorstep, and Nora turned to face him, suddenly uncertain. The evening had been lovely, but what came next? A handshake, a promise to meet again, or simply a polite goodbye, and the understanding that this had been a singular event. Ryder seemed to sense her uncertainty. Miss Blackburn, Nora, if I may, I would very much like to see you again. My work here will keep me in Cripple Creek for at least a fortnight. Would you consider accompanying me on a picnic this Sunday afternoon? The weather promises to be fine. A picnic. In broad daylight, where the entire town could see them together. It was a declaration of sorts, a public acknowledgement that their dinner had not been a mere courtesy or a one-time occurrence. I would like that, she heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Wonderful. I'll call for you at noon. Then, with a gentleness that took her breath away, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Nora. Dream well. As Nora watched him walk away down the moonlit street, she felt something shifting within her, like ice breaking up on a river after a long, cold winter. It was hope, she realized with a start. Hope, and the dangerous, exhilarating possibility that at 40, her story might not be as settled as everyone, including herself, had assumed. She touched the spot on her hand where his lips had been, the sensation still tingling on her skin, and allowed herself to contemplate the unthinkable, that she might not be too old for romance after all. Sunday dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect late spring day that seemed designed for picnics and outdoor gatherings. Nora rose early, as was her habit, but found herself unusually indecisive about how to spend the morning hours before Roland was due to arrive. Normally, she would use a Sunday morning to catch up on mending or raiding, but today she felt too restless for either activity. Instead, she found herself paying unusual attention to her appearance. She washed her hair and let it dry in the morning sun, brushing it until it shone with silver and chestnut highlights. For her dress, she chose a lightweight cotton in a soft sage green that she had sewn the previous summer but had worn only once. It was more casual than the blue silk she had worn to dinner, but still flattering. With delicate embroidery, she had added herself along the collar and cuffs. As she dressed, Nora tried to temper her expectations for the day. It was only a picnic, after all, a few hours in pleasant company before Roland Ryder moved on, as men like him inevitably did. She was too old and too practical to believe in fairy tales that began with chance meetings in saloons and ended with happily ever after. Yet despite her best efforts, a persistent flutter of anticipation remained in her chest as noon approached. It had been so long since she had felt this way, this curious mixture of nervousness and excitement, of wondering what might happen next. At precisely noon, a knock came at her door. Nora took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts one last time, and went to answer it. Roland stood on her doorstep, looking handsomer than ever in the bright sunlight. He wore a clean white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, dark trousers, and a vest in a subtle gray check pattern. In one hand, he carried a wicker picnic basket. "Good afternoon," he greeted her with a warm smile. "You look lovely, Nora." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy under his appreciative gaze. "You've come prepared, I see." He lifted the basket. "Courtesy of Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house. She seemed quite invested in our outing when I mentioned it at breakfast." I believe her exact words were, "It's about time someone showed that Blackburn woman a proper day out." Nora laughed despite herself. "Martha Peterson has been trying to marry me off since I arrived in Cripple Creek. I'm surprised she hasn't already planned the wedding." "Give her time," Roland replied with a wink. "She did suggest a particularly scenic spot for our picnic, though. Apparently there's a meadow about a mile north of town, near the old Wilson homestead." "I know it well," Nora said, reaching for her hat and light shawl. "It's beautiful this time of year, with wildflowers just coming into bloom." They set off through town, and Nora was acutely aware of the curious glances and not so subtle pointing from townsfolk they passed. By now, news of their dinner at the Grand Hotel had circulated thoroughly, spawning speculation that ranged from the romantic to the scandalous. "We're causing quite a stir," Roland observed as they passed the general store, where Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Cooper had abandoned all pretense of shopping to stare openly at them. "Small towns thrive on gossip," Nora replied with a shrug. "By tomorrow, there will be a new topic of interest." "I'm not so sure," he said, glancing down at her with a smile that made her heart skip. "A beautiful woman and a mysterious stranger, that's the stuff of dime novels right there." Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks at being called beautiful so casually, as if it were an obvious fact rather than a gallant exaggeration. "Hardly," she demurred. "More likely they're placing bets on how quickly you'll move on once you realize you're courting the town spinster." Roland stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Is that what I'm doing? Courting you? Nora froze, mortified by her slip. "I didn't mean to presume, because if I am," he continued, his gray eyes serious now, "I'd like to do it properly, with your full knowledge and consent." For a moment, Nora couldn't breathe. "Mr. Ryder, Roland, surely you jest. I'm 40 years old, well past the age for courtship. Are you?" He challenged gently. "Who decided that? Some arbitrary social convention that says a woman's worth expires after a certain birthday?" "It's not about worth," she protested. "It's about practicality. Men court women to marry them, to start families with them. I'm too old for children, too set in my ways for marriage." "I'm 37, Roland replied calmly. "Also rather set in my ways, I'm told. And while children would be a blessing, they're not the only reason to seek a companion for life." He took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Nora, I've spent 2 days in your company, and in that brief time, I've found more stimulating conversation, more genuine connection than in years of social engagements back east. I don't know where this might lead, but I would very much like to find out if you're willing." Nora stared at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity or pity. She found none, only an open, earnest expression that made her heart ache with unexpected longing. "People will talk," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let them," he replied simply. "I've never much cared for others' opinions of my personal choices." Nora hesitated, standing at a crossroads she had never expected to face again. Caution urged her to step back, to protect herself from the inevitable disappointment of hoping for too much. But something stronger, something that felt remarkably like courage, pushed her forward. "I would like that too," she finally said. "To see where this might lead." The smile that broke across Roland's face was like sunlight after rain, bright, warm, and full of promise. "Then it's settled," he said, offering his arm once more. "Now, shall we continue to our picnic? I'm told Mrs. Peterson's fried chicken is the best in 3 counties." The meadow, when they reached it, was every bit as beautiful as Nora had remembered. Wildflowers dotted the lush grass with splashes of blue, yellow, and purple, and a small creek burbled along one edge, providing a soothing background melody. They settled beneath the spreading branches of an old oak tree, Roland laying out a blanket from the picnic basket while Nora arranged the feast. Mrs. Peterson had prepared fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, apple tarts, and a bottle of lemonade. As they ate, they continued the easy conversation they had begun at dinner, sharing stories and opinions, discovering the many ways their tastes and perspectives aligned. Roland told her more about his work as a surveyor, describing the beautiful landscapes he'd seen and the interesting people he'd met in his travels. Nora shared tales from her years in Cripple Creek, the changes she'd witnessed as the town grew from a mining camp to a proper settlement. "What will you do when the surveying is complete?" Nora asked as they finished the last of the apple tarts. "Will you move on to the next project?" Roland leaned back against the trunk of the oak, considering the question. "That depends," he said thoughtfully. "In the past, I've always followed the work, never staying in one place longer than the job required. But lately, I've been thinking it might be time to put down roots somewhere." "What sort of place would tempt you to stay?" Nora asked, trying to keep her tone casual despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. His eyes met hers, steady and warm. "A place with good people, honest work, and perhaps," he added softly, "a reason to wake up each morning with anticipation rather than resignation." The implication hung in the air between them, too new and fragile to acknowledge directly but too significant to ignore. Nora looked away first, her gaze traveling across the meadow to the distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the spring warmth. "It's beautiful here," she said, changing the subject slightly. I don't come out this way often enough. Too busy with the shop, I suppose. That's the trouble with responsibility, Roland agreed, allowing the shift in conversation. It has a way of filling all available space if you let it. Is that why you've avoided settling down? To maintain your freedom, he considered this. Partly, perhaps, though I think it's more that I never found a place or a person that made me want to stay more than I wanted to see what was over the next horizon. His expression turned reflective. My father used to say I had wanderlust in my blood. It wasn't a compliment. And now, Nora asked, hardly daring to breathe. Roland's gaze returned to her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Now, I'm beginning to understand that horizons can be just as beautiful when viewed from the same spot each day, especially if that view is shared. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away this time. You have quite a way with words, Mr. Ryder. Occupational hazard of a Harvard education, he replied with a grin. Though in this case, I'm simply speaking the truth as I see it. They fell into a comfortable silence, the gentle sounds of the creek and birdsong filling the air around them. Nora couldn't remember the last time she had felt so at peace, so content in the moment without worrying about what needed to be done next or what others might think. Would you walk with me? Roland asked eventually, rising to his feet and offering his hand. I'd like to see more of this beautiful spot. Nora placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her up, the casual touch sending a pleasant tingle up her arm. They packed the remnants of their picnic back into the basket and left it beneath the tree, then set off along the creek, walking close enough that their hands occasionally brushed against each other. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the leaves of the trees that lined the creek, creating a constantly shifting pattern of light and dark on the path before them. They walked in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts yet somehow together in the shared experience of the moment. May I ask you something personal? Roland said eventually, his voice gentle. You may ask, Nora replied cautiously. Though I reserve the right not to answer, he smiled at that. Fair enough. I was wondering. You mentioned that you never married. Was that by choice or circumstance? It was a question Nora had been asked many times over the years, though rarely so directly. Usually it came wrapped in layers of pity or judgment. Poor dear, never found anyone, or too choosy for her own good. Both, I suppose, she answered after a moment's consideration. When I was younger, there were opportunities, but none that seemed worth giving up my independence for. By the time I might have been ready to reconsider, the opportunities had diminished. The men of Cripple Creek must be blind fools, Roland said with such genuine perplexity that Nora couldn't help but laugh. Hardly that, she said. Just practical. A man looking for a wife generally wants someone young enough to bear children, to help build a legacy. By 35, I was considered firmly on the shelf, as they say. And what about love? He asked. Did that ever factor into your considerations? Nora paused, considering how honest to be. Once, she finally admitted. There was a man, Edward Carmichael. He owned the assay office in town. We were close for a time, I thought perhaps. She trailed off, the old pain surprisingly muted after all these years. But he married a widow from Denver with 2 small children. He wanted a family, you see, something I couldn't give him. Roland was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. I'm sorry, he said eventually. That must have been difficult. It was for a time, Nora acknowledged. But life goes on, doesn't it? And I built a good one for myself. Independent, secure, lonely, he asked softly. Nora looked up at him, startled by his perception. Sometimes, she admitted. Though I have friends, community. It's not the same as having a partner, but it's not nothing. No, it's not nothing, he agreed. But perhaps it's not everything either. They had reached a bend in the creek where the water pooled deeply before continuing its journey downward. A large, flat rock jutted out over the pool, creating a natural seat with a view of the water below. "Shall we rest here for a while?" Roland suggested, indicating the rock. They settled side by side on the sun-warmed surface, their shoulders nearly touching. For several minutes they simply sat in silence, watching the play of light on the water and the occasional flash of a trout beneath the surface. "You asked about love earlier," Roland said finally, his voice thoughtful. "If I've learned anything in my years of wandering, it's that love doesn't adhere to schedules or societal expectations. It arrives when it chooses, often when least expected or convenient." Nora turned to look at him, struck by the sentiment. "That's a rather romantic view for a practical man." He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the deep blue of the sky above. "Perhaps I'm not as practical as I appear," he said with a small smile. "Or perhaps meeting you has awakened aspects of my nature that have been dormant for too long." The directness of his statement took Nora's breath away. They had known each other for mere days, yet there was an undeniable connection between them, a sense of recognition that defied rational explanation. "Roland," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say but feeling compelled to speak nonetheless. Before she could continue, he reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Nora, I know this is sudden, unconventional even, but I've spent enough years following the expected path to know when something rare and valuable appears before me." His thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand, sending shivers up her arm. "I don't want to frighten you or push too quickly, but I also don't want to pretend that what I'm feeling is anything less than extraordinary." Nora's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "And what are you feeling?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like a man who's been wandering in the desert and suddenly stumbled upon an oasis," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "Like someone who's been speaking a language no one else understands until, unexpectedly, he meets someone fluent in the same tongue." "That's poetic," Nora managed, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words and the answering resonance within her own heart. "Harvard education again," he said with a self-deprecating smile, "but the sentiment is genuine if inelegantly expressed." "No," she said quickly. "It wasn't inelegant at all, it was beautiful." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and not entirely one-sided. The hope that blazed in his eyes at her words was almost painful to witness, so bright and earnest that Nora felt momentarily unworthy of inspiring such feeling. "Nora," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "May I kiss you?" The question, so formal and respectful, touched her deeply. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with desire, had sought her permission for such intimacy. Wordlessly, she nodded, her eyes never leaving his. Roland leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. His hand came up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness, as if she were something precious and fragile. Then his lips met hers, and Nora's world narrowed to that single point of contact, warm, gentle, and utterly transformative. The kiss was brief but profound, a silent promise exchanged without words. When they parted, Nora felt changed somehow, as if the woman who had walked to this spot was not quite the same one who would walk back. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you in the saloon," Roland confessed, his hand still cradling her face. Nora smiled, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Even before I'd agreed to mend your waistcoat. How presumptuous." He laughed, the sound mingling with the burble of the creek. "Guilty as charged. There was something about the way you held yourself so dignified and self-contained that made me want to know what you'd be like when those walls came down. And now that you've had a glimpse," she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. His expression softened, the laughter fading to something deeper and more serious. "Now I want to know everything else. Every thought, every dream, every disappointment and triumph that has shaped you into the woman sitting beside me." Nora's breath caught at the sincerity in his voice. "That would take considerably longer than a fortnight," she said, referring to the timeline he'd mentioned for his work in Cripple Creek. "Then perhaps I'll need to find reasons to extend my stay," he replied, his hand finding hers again and intertwining their fingers. "Or reasons to return once the initial survey is complete." The implication that this was not merely a passing diversion for him both thrilled and frightened Nora. She had built her life around self-sufficiency, around the certainty that she was complete on her own. The possibility of allowing someone else into that carefully constructed independence was as terrifying as it was enticing. "Roland," she said carefully, "I don't want you to feel obligated by these feelings we're experiencing. You have your work, your life beyond Cripple Creek. I wouldn't want to be the reason you alter those plans." "Not an obligation," he corrected gently. "A choice. Perhaps the most important one I've made in years." He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "But I understand your caution. We've known each other only briefly, and there's much still to discover. I'm not asking for promises, Nora. Only the chance to see where this might lead, with open hearts and honest intentions." Put that way, it seemed both reasonable and thrilling, an adventure of a different sort than either of them had experienced before. "I would like that," Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. "To see where this might lead." Roland's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then it's settled," he said, echoing his words from days earlier. "Now, shall we head back before Mrs. Peterson organizes a search party? I have a feeling she's deeply invested in the outcome of our picnic." Nora laughed, the tension of the moment broken. "Martha Peterson has been orchestrating matches in this town since before I arrived. She'll be insufferably pleased with herself if she thinks she had a hand in this one." They gathered their belongings and began the walk back to town, hand in hand now without pretense or hesitation. The afternoon light had begun to soften toward evening, casting long shadows across the meadow and gilding the distant mountains with gold. As they crested the small rise that would lead them back to the main road into Cripple Creek, Nora paused, looking back at the peaceful scene they were leaving. "Thank you for this afternoon," she said softly. "It's been more than I expected." Roland followed her gaze, then looked back at her with an expression of such tender appreciation that Nora felt her heart turn over in her chest. "The unexpected often brings the greatest joys," he said, "and this is just the beginning." As they continued toward town, Nora found herself, for the first time in many years, looking forward to tomorrow with something more than peaceful acceptance, with genuine anticipation, with hope, and with the dawning realization that perhaps, at 40, her story was far from over. In fact, it might just be beginning. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of unprecedented happiness for Nora. Each day brought some new interaction with Roland: a shared meal, a walk through town, evenings spent talking by the fire in her small parlor. He was attentive without being overbearing, respectful of her independence while making it clear that he cherished her company above all others. Cripple Creek, predictably, buzzed with gossip about their burgeoning courtship. Opinions ranged from romantic approval to scandalized disapproval, with every shade of judgment in between. Some, like Martha Peterson, were openly delighted by the match. Others, particularly among the older, more traditional members of the community, muttered about the impropriety of a woman Nora's age engaging in such obvious romantic pursuits. Mrs. Mitchell told me directly that I was making a spectacle of myself. Nora informed Roland with more amusement than offense as they shared tea in her shop one afternoon. Apparently, a woman of 40 should either be contentedly married or gracefully resigned to spinsterhood, not gallivanting about town with a mysterious stranger. Roland, who was examining a bolt of blue cotton she'd recently ordered, looked up with raised eyebrows. Gallivanting. Is that what we've been doing? And here I thought we were merely taking walks and having conversations. Scandalous behavior indeed, Nora agreed with mock solemnity. Next thing you know, we'll be holding hands in broad daylight. The horror, he replied, setting down the fabric to approach her. Though now that you mention it. He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips for a kiss that had become a familiar gesture between them. I find I rather enjoy scandalizing the good people of Cripple Creek. Nora smiled, the warmth of his touch still sending that same delightful tingle through her after 2 weeks of courtship. You're incorrigible, Mr. Ryder. So my father always said, he agreed cheerfully. Though in my defense, I've been on my very best behavior. My intentions toward you are entirely honorable. Are they now? Nora asked, her tone light despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. They had not spoken explicitly of the future, both content for the moment to enjoy the present without burdening it with expectations. Roland's expression sobered, his gray eyes intent on hers. Completely honorable, he confirmed. In fact, I've been meaning to speak with you about that. He glanced toward the shop door where customers might enter at any moment. Perhaps not here, though. Would you join me for dinner at the Grand Hotel this evening? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. Nora nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. Of course. What time shall I expect you? 7, as usual, he said, squeezing her hand once more before releasing it. I should get back to work now. We're finishing the survey of the northern route today. After he left, Nora found it almost impossible to focus on her work. The half-finished dress for Mrs. Cooper's daughter lay neglected on her table as she paced the small shop, her mind racing with speculation about what Roland might want to discuss. Was he planning to propose? The possibility both thrilled and terrified her. 2 weeks was an absurdly short time to consider marriage, especially at their age. And yet, there was a certainty about their connection that defied rational timelines, a sense of rightness that made conventional caution seem almost irrelevant. Or perhaps he was planning to tell her that his work in Cripple Creek was complete, that he would be moving on to the next survey site. The thought sent a cold spike of fear through her heart. She had known from the beginning that his stay was temporary, that his profession required mobility. And yet, she had allowed herself to hope that perhaps. By the time evening arrived, Nora was a bundle of nerves, alternating between excitement and dread as she prepared for dinner. She chose her finest dress, a deep burgundy silk that she had made for herself the previous winter, but had never worn, saving it for a special occasion that had never materialized. The color complemented her chestnut hair and fair complexion, making her look, if not younger exactly, then perhaps more vibrant than her usual practical attire allowed. Roland arrived precisely at 7, as promised, looking more formal than usual in a well-tailored dark suit with his burgundy waistcoat beneath. When he saw Nora in her matching gown, he laughed with delight. "Great minds," he said, gesturing between their coordinated outfits. "You look absolutely breathtaking, Nora." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a girlish pleasure at the compliment. "You're quite handsome yourself this evening." The walk to the Grand Hotel was charged with anticipation. their conversation lighter than usual as both seemed aware of the weightier discussion to come. The hotel's dining room was busy, it being Saturday night, but Roland had reserved a table in a quieter corner, affording them some privacy among the crowded room. After they had ordered and been served their first course, a delicate mushroom soup, Roland cleared his throat, his expression suddenly serious. "Nora," he began, reaching across the table to take her hand. "These past 2 weeks have been among the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, spending time with you, it's changed something fundamental within me." Nora's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the entire dining room must hear it. "I feel the same," she said softly. But Roland, he raised his free hand, asking for her patience. "Please, let me finish. This is important." At her nod, he continued. "My survey work here is complete. The railroad has confirmed they intend to build the spur line, which means I should be moving on to the next project." Nora felt her heart sink, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "I see," she said, her voice remarkably steady given the disappointment crashing through her. "When do you leave?" "That depends," he replied, his gaze intent on hers. "On you." "On me," she echoed, confused. Roland took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "Nora, I know this may seem sudden, perhaps even foolish given the short time we've known each other, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He squeezed her hand gently. "I love you. I want to spend my life with you if you'll have me." The world seemed to stop for a moment, the bustling dining room fading to a distant blur as Nora focused solely on the man before her and the extraordinary words he had just spoken. "Roland," she breathed, her voice barely audible. Are you proposing marriage?" "I am," he confirmed, a smile breaking across his face despite the tension of the moment, though perhaps not as eloquently as I'd planned. "But we've only known each other 2 weeks, she protested weakly, though her heart was singing with joy. 2 weeks in which I've learned more about you and about myself than in years of more conventional acquaintance, he countered. I know your favorite books, how you take your tea, the way your eyes crinkle at the corners when you're truly amused. I know you're kind to children and patient with the elderly and intolerant of hypocrisy. I know you're strong and independent and utterly capable of living a fulfilling life without me." His voice softened. "And yet, selfishly, I find myself hoping you might choose a life with me instead." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome in this public setting. "But what about your work, your travels? I have a business here, a life established." "I've spoken with the railroad," Roland said. "They've offered me a position as their regional surveyor, based in Denver but with responsibility for this entire area. I would still travel sometimes, but Cripple Creek could be our home base. You could keep your shop, your independence." He paused, his expression earnest. "I would never ask you to give up what you've built, Nora. I want to add to your life, not diminish it." The thoughtfulness of his proposal, the way he had considered her needs and desires alongside his own, touched Nora deeply. This was not a man seeking a convenient wife or a caretaker for his declining years. This was a partner, offering to build something new together while honoring what each had already created separately. "People will talk," she said, echoing her words from their earlier conversation. "They'll say I'm too old for marriage, that we're being foolish and impulsive." "Let them talk," Roland replied firmly. "They said you were too old for marriage. I say I'm young enough for both of us." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "The only opinions that matter in this are yours and mine. And I know with absolute certainty that I want to spend whatever years we have left building a life together." Nora really looked at him, taking in the sincerity in his gray eyes, the hint of vulnerability beneath his confident exterior. the hope and love shining so clearly in his expression. And in that moment, all her doubts and fears seemed to recede, leaving only the clear, undeniable truth. She loved this man with a depth and certainty that defied rational explanation. "Yes," she said simply, a smile breaking across her face like dawn after a long night. "Yes, I will marry you, Roland Ryder." His answering smile was incandescent, transforming his handsome features into something almost transcendently beautiful. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "You don't need more time to consider." Nora shook her head, surprising herself with her own conviction. "I'm 40 years old, Roland. I've had a lifetime to learn who I am and what I want, and I want you, uncertainties and all." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with such reverence that Nora felt tears threatening again. "You've made me the happiest man in Colorado, Nora Blackburn, perhaps in all the Western Territories." Such grandiose claims, she teased, though her own happiness was so intense it was almost painful. "How will you prove them?" "By spending the rest of my life showing you how cherished you are," he replied without hesitation. "Starting tonight and continuing for as long as we both shall live." The formality of the phrase echoing marriage vows yet to be spoken sent a shiver of anticipation through Nora. This was real. This was happening. At 40 years old, she was engaged to be married to a man who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever beheld. "When?" she asked, practical considerations beginning to assert themselves through the haze of happiness. "How soon do you want to marry?" "Tomorrow, if it were possible," Roland admitted with a laugh. "But I suspect certain social niceties should be observed, even for an unconventional couple such as ourselves." "A month, then," Nora decided, surprising herself with her own decisiveness. "That will give us time to make the necessary arrangements without dragging out the engagement unnecessarily." "A month it is," Roland agreed, his expression one of deep contentment. "June 15th. A summer wedding for a new beginning." They finished their meal in a state of shared euphoria, making plans and sharing dreams for their future together. By the time Roland escorted Nora home, the news of their engagement had already begun to spread through the hotel and into the town beyond, carried by the waitstaff and other diners who had witnessed Roland's proposal and Nora's acceptance. At her doorstep, Roland took both her hands in his expression serious despite the joy still evident in his eyes. "I want you to know something, Nora," he said softly. "I didn't propose to you despite your age or mine. I proposed to you because of who you are, a woman of substance, of character, of depth. The years that have shaped you into that woman are not a liability to be overlooked, but a gift to be treasured." Tears filled Nora's eyes at his words, healing something deep within her that she hadn't even realized was wounded. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, "for seeing me as I am, not as convention says I should be." "Always," he promised, leaning down to kiss her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the man he was and the husband he would be. As Nora watched him walk away into the night, her heart full to bursting with unexpected joy, she silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him into her shop that day. At 40, her life was not ending or diminishing, as she had been led to believe. It was expanding, brightening, opening to possibilities she had long since stopped allowing herself to imagine. The whispered judgments too old for marriage no longer held any power over her. Roland was right. Age was just a number, and love recognized no such arbitrary boundaries. Their story was just beginning, written not in the expectations of others but in the choices they made together, in the life they would build side by side. And what a beautiful story it promised to be. The news of Nora Blackburn's engagement to Roland Ryder spread through Cripple Creek like wildfire. By Sunday morning, there wasn't a soul in town who hadn't heard about the proposal at the Grand Hotel and Nora's acceptance. Reactions were mixed, as expected. Martha Peterson was triumphant, taking full credit for introducing them via the picnic suggestion. The younger women in town found the whole affair romantic, while many of the older, more traditional residents clucked their tongues at the impropriety of such a hasty courtship. A month's engagement at their age, Nora overheard Mrs. Mitchell telling Mrs. Cooper outside the church that Sunday. It's unseemly, as if they're in some adolescent rush to the altar. Better late than never, I always say, Mrs. Cooper replied, surprising Nora with her defense. And did you see her face during the service? I don't think I've ever seen Nora Blackburn look so happy. It was true. Despite the whispers and stares, Nora found herself floating through the days following her engagement in a state of profound happiness that was impervious to outside judgment. Roland had officially extended his stay in Cripple Creek, taking a room at the boarding house until the wedding, and they spent every available moment together, planning their future and deepening their understanding of each other. In the evenings, they would sit in Nora's small parlor, talking for hours about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, the books they'd read and places they'd seen. Each conversation revealed new facets of Roland's character that only confirmed Nora's conviction that she had made the right choice. "I want to build you a proper home," he told her one evening, a week after their engagement. They were sitting side by side on her small sofa, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against him. "Something with more space than this, but still closed to your shop." "This has been my home for 15 years, Nora said, glancing around the cozy room with its familiar furnishings and the quilt her mother had made draped over the back of the rocking chair. "I'm not sure I need anything grander." "Not grander," Roland corrected gently. "Just more suitable for two people who might occasionally want to entertain friends or family, and perhaps with a proper garden for you. I've noticed how you tend those few flowers by your shop door." Nora smiled, touched by his observation and the thoughtfulness behind it. "A garden would be nice," she admitted. "I've always wanted to grow roses but never had the space or time to tend them properly." "Then roses you shall have," he promised. "Red and yellow and pink, all the colors you desire." "And what about you?" she asked, turning to look up at him. "What would make this new home yours as well as mine?" Roland considered the question seriously. "A study, perhaps, somewhere to keep my books and maps, and a wide porch facing west to watch the sunset over the mountains." Nora could see it in her mind's eye, a comfortable house with roses climbing the fence, a broad porch with two rocking chairs side by side, and inside, rooms filled with the combined treasures of their separate lives, now joined as one. It was a lovely vision, one that made her heart swell with anticipation. "I think we could manage that," she said softly. "There's that parcel of land at the edge of town just past the Wilsons' place. It has a beautiful view of the mountains." "I'll inquire about it tomorrow," Roland said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We could start building right away, have it ready by autumn." The casual way he spoke about autumn, implying a future stretching well beyond their wedding day, filled Nora with a quiet joy. This was real, this future they were planning together. Not a dream or a fantasy, but a tangible reality taking shape before her eyes. The following week was a flurry of preparations. Nora began work on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown in ivory silk, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Roland secured the land they had discussed and engaged a builder to draw up plans for their new home. They met with Reverend Mitchell to arrange the ceremony, enduring his thinly veiled disapproval of their hasty timeline with good-humored patience. "It's not as if we're impetuous youths," Roland told Nora after a particularly trying meeting with the Reverend. "At our age, we know our own minds." "That's precisely what troubles him," Nora replied with a wry smile. "A woman my age should be beyond such passionate decisions." Roland stopped walking to face her fully, his expression suddenly serious. "Does that bother you, the judgment about your age?" Nora considered the question honestly. "It used to," she admitted. "I've spent years hearing that I'm too old for this or that, too old for marriage, too old for new beginnings, too old for dreams beyond my established routine. And I believed it in a way, accepted it as the natural order of things." She reached up to touch his face, her palm against his cheek. "But you've helped me see how arbitrary those limitations are, how life doesn't stop offering possibilities just because you've passed some imaginary threshold of years." The smile that spread across Roland's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "You are the most remarkable woman, Nora Blackburn," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "And in precisely 2 weeks and 3 days, you'll be my wife. Age and opinion be damned." "Age and opinion be damned," she echoed, loving the freedom in the words, the defiance of expectations that had constrained her for too long. As their wedding day approached, unexpected support began to emerge from various quarters. Mrs. Cooper and several other women from the town offered to help with preparations for the small reception they planned to hold at the Grand Hotel following the ceremony. Sheriff Caldwell, initially suspicious of Roland, had warmed to him considerably and offered to stand as his best man. Even Reverend Mitchell's wife, despite her husband's reservations, presented Nora with a beautiful hand-embroidered tablecloth as an early wedding gift. "Every home needs beautiful things," she told Nora with unexpected warmth. "And every marriage deserves to be celebrated, regardless of when in life it occurs." The morning of June 15th dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that seemed created especially for weddings. Nora awoke early, a fluttering mixture of excitement and nerves in her stomach. This was her wedding day, a day she had long ago stopped expecting to experience. Martha Peterson arrived shortly after breakfast, along with Mrs. Cooper and Lily, to help Nora prepare. They filled her small home with chatter and laughter as they arranged her hair in an elegant style, secured the delicate veil she had crafted, and helped her into the ivory silk gown that was her masterpiece. "You look beautiful, Miss Blackburn," Lily Cooper said softly as Nora stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing the radiant woman who looked back at her. "Like a princess in a fairy tale." "Thank you, Lily," Nora replied, touched by the girl's sincerity. "Though at my age, I think I'm more the fairy godmother than the princess." "Nonsense," Martha declared firmly. "Age is just a number, and today you're a bride. The most beautiful bride Cripple Creek has seen in many a year." The church was filled when Nora arrived, which surprised her. She had expected only a handful of people, close friends and neighbors, but it seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the event that had been the primary topic of gossip for a month. Sheriff Caldwell met her at the church door, offering his arm with a warm smile. "You look stunning, Nora," he said. "Ryder's a lucky man." "Would you do me the honor of giving me away, Tom?" she asked impulsively. "I've no family here, and you've been a good friend over the years." The sheriff's weathered face creased in a broad smile. "I'd be honored," he said, patting her hand where it rested on his arm. "Though between us, I think you're giving yourself away quite capably." As the church doors opened and the small ensemble began to play, Nora's eyes found Roland immediately. He stood at the altar, tall and handsome in his new suit, his face lighting up with such undisguised joy at the sight of her that Nora felt tears prick at her eyes. The walk down the aisle seemed both eternal and instantaneous. And then she was there, beside the man she had chosen, the man who had chosen her, ready to speak vows that would bind their lives together. Reverend Mitchell, whatever his private reservations might be, conducted the ceremony with dignity and grace. When it came time for the vows, Roland took Nora's hands in his voice clear and strong as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life. When it was Nora's turn, she looked up into Roland's gray eyes and found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of the step they were taking. But then he squeezed her hands gently, a silent reassurance, and the words came easily. "I, Nora, take you, Roland, to be my husband," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. By the power vested in me," Reverend Mitchell intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Roland's lips met hers in a kiss that was both tender and profound, a sealing of promises and a beginning of their life together. As they turned to face the congregation, now husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers, any lingering disapproval drowned out by the genuine good wishes of a community celebrating love in its midst. The reception at the Grand Hotel was a joyous affair, with good food, music from a local string quartet, and enough champagne to ensure that even the most skeptical guests were eventually raising their glasses in sincere toasts to the newlyweds. Nora found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of whom had previously been among her most vocal critics. "I must admit, I had my doubts," Mrs. Mitchell confided as they stood near the refreshment table. "But seeing you together, well, it's clear as day that you belong with each other." "Age be hanged." "Thank you, Elizabeth," Nora replied, genuinely touched by the older woman's change of heart. "That means a great deal to me." As the afternoon wore on, Nora found herself increasingly eager for the festivities to end, for the moment when she and Roland would begin their life together in earnest. They had agreed to spend their wedding night at the Grand Hotel in the finest suite, a luxury neither had experienced before returning to her small home the next day to begin their shared life while their new house was being built. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long golden rays through the hotel windows, Roland appeared at her side, taking her hand discreetly in his. "Are you ready to slip away, Mrs. Ryder?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. The new name sent a thrill through Nora. Mrs. Ryder. She was a wife now, this man's wife. "I am indeed, Mr. Ryder," she replied, squeezing his hand. "More than ready." They made their farewells as unobtrusively as possible, though the knowing smiles and occasional ribald comment made it clear that their departure was well understood by all. Nora felt a momentary flash of self-consciousness, a woman her age, embarking on a wedding night like a blushing young bride, but it faded quickly in the face of Roland's obvious anticipation, and her own deep longing for privacy and intimacy with her new husband. The hotel suite was beautiful, with a large four-poster bed, plush carpets, and windows that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the mountains. Someone Martha Peterson, Nora suspected, had arranged for flowers to be placed around the room, filling the air with the sweet scent of roses and lilacs. As Roland closed and locked the door behind them, a sudden shyness overcame Nora. They had shared kisses and embraces during their courtship, but always with propriety, always with restraint appropriate to their ages and positions. Now, as husband and wife, that restraint was no longer necessary, but Nora found herself uncertain how to proceed. Roland seemed to sense her hesitation. He crossed to where she stood by the window and took her hands in his expression tender. "We have all night," he said softly. "All our lives, in fact. There's no rush, no expectation beyond what feels right to us." The gentleness in his voice, the understanding in his eyes, melted something within Nora. This was Roland, the man who had truly seen her when others had looked past. The man who had valued her experience rather than discounting it, who had considered her age an asset rather than a liability. "I love you," she said simply, the words coming easily now, though she had been sparing with them during their courtship. "I never expected to feel this way at my age, but I'm so very glad I have." "As am I," he replied, raising her hand to his lips for a kiss. "More grateful than I can express that you chose me, that we found each other against all odds and expectations." There in the fading light of their wedding day, Nora Blackburn Ryder and her husband began their life together, not as a young couple with decades stretching out before them, but as two people who had lived enough to recognize the rare gift they had been given and to cherish it accordingly. Age, they had both discovered, was indeed just a number. It was wisdom and experience and perspective, yes, but it was not a limitation. Not on love, not on beginning anew, not on embracing the possibilities that life continued to offer, no matter how many years had passed. And as night fell over Cripple Creek, two people whose society had deemed too old for such passionate beginnings proved just how wrong that assessment had been. 5 years later, Nora sat on the wide porch of the home she and Roland had built together, watching the setting sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Beside her, in a matching rocking chair, sat her husband, his hand resting comfortably on the arm of her chair, occasionally reaching over to brush her fingers with his own. The house had turned out exactly as they had envisioned, spacious but cozy, with Roland's study filled with books and maps, Nora's sewing room flooded with natural light, and a garden that had become the envy of Cripple Creek. The rose bushes were in full bloom now, their heavy blossoms nodding in the evening breeze, filling the air with sweet fragrance. "Penny for your thoughts," Roland said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Nora smiled, turning to look at the man who had transformed her life with his unexpected arrival 5 years earlier. His hair was more silver than dark now, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his gaze was as warm and steady as ever, his love for her an unwavering constant. "I was thinking about how fortunate we are," she replied truthfully. "How rich our life together has become. And it had, in ways neither could have anticipated on their wedding day. Roland's work with the railroad had expanded, his expertise sought by companies throughout the West. Nora's dressmaking business had thrived as well, her reputation spreading far beyond Cripple Creek. They had traveled together to San Francisco, to New York, even to Europe the previous year, experiences that had broadened their horizons while deepening their appreciation for the home and life they had built. But the greatest enrichment had come in the form of family, not children of their own, as that door had closed for Nora years before they met, but in the young people they had taken under their wing. Lily Cooper, now 21 and a talented seamstress in her own right, had become Nora's apprentice and eventually her business partner. Thomas Caldwell, the sheriff's nephew, had shown an aptitude for surveying that Roland had nurtured, taking the boy on as his assistant during school holidays and eventually helping him secure admission to a prestigious engineering school back east. There were others, 2 children and young adults, who found in the Ryder's home a haven of acceptance and encouragement, a place where their dreams were taken seriously and their potential recognized. Roland and Nora had become, in their own way, parents to a generation of Cripple Creek's youth, their influence extending far beyond what biological parenthood might have offered. "You ever regret it?" Roland asked, his question echoing one she had posed to him early in their courtship. Marrying so late in life, missing out on the traditional family path, Nora considered the question seriously, as was her habit. "No," she finally said. "I can honestly say I have no regrets. We've created something wonderful together, something uniquely ours. And in many ways, we've had the best of both worlds, the freedom of our younger years to establish ourselves independently, and now the joy of sharing our lives in full awareness of what that means." Roland nodded, understanding as he always did. "I feel the same," he said. "Though sometimes I wish we'd found each other sooner, had more years together." "We have now," Nora reminded him, reaching over to take his hand fully in hers. "And all the days ahead, that's what matters." As darkness fell, and the first stars appeared in the clear Colorado sky, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had once believed, as had so many others, that her chance for deep personal happiness had passed with her youth, that at 40, she was indeed too old for the kind of transformative love she had found with Roland. How wrong they had all been. The years since their marriage had been the richest, most fulfilling of her life, not in spite of their ages when they met, but in many ways because of them. They had come together as fully formed individuals, secure in themselves yet open to growth together, bringing to their partnership a depth of experience and self-knowledge that youth rarely possessed. "Shall we go in?" Roland asked as the evening chill began to settle around them. "I believe you promised me a game of chess tonight." "So I did," Nora agreed, rising from her chair with the grace that had always characterized her movements. "Though I warn you, I've been practicing with Thomas. I might actually beat you this time." Roland laughed, the sound as dear to Nora now as it had been the first time she heard it. "I look forward to the challenge, my love." Hand in hand, they walked into the warm light of the home they had created together. Two people who had defied convention and expectation to write their own story, on their own terms in their own time. Age, they had discovered, was indeed just a number. It was the heart that remained eternally young enough for love, for new beginnings, for the joy of shared days and nights in the company of a true companion. And in finding each other, they had proved what Roland had declared so boldly on the day he proposed. She was never too old for marriage, and he would always be young enough for love. That truth, simple yet profound, had shaped the beautiful life they continued to build together, one day, one moment, one shared joy at a time.